I'm here from Maine. I live on a little island called Moose Island, of course. It's right on the coastal Canadian border, and it's about a town that's this big. I think there's maybe this many people in the town that I'm from. And we all find each other at the IGA, which is our local grocery store. So it's a funny, small, very different life up there than lives that I've led in other places. But it's been a really great place to land. I've been there about 5 years now. And yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've been there about 5 years after living in other places in Maine and other locations, as Alicia pointed out. I'm going to start this talk without any further ado, not showing you images, although I think I'm just going to let that image sit on the screen. I was trying to figure out what might be useful to share with you all. And I don't know if this is, but I hope it is. So I'm going to share with you, it's sort of like a mantra. It's like what I aspire to when I'm in the studio and working. And it's kind of a list of ideas that I'm striving for. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to show you a bunch of work, and then maybe I'll read these off at the end again too, like bookends to this conversation. So my first talking point is do something you don't know how to do. I love how some of you are taking notes. This is so great. This talk I think is going to be online afterwards, so if you don't want to take notes, you could just watch it later again. But do something you don't know how to do. And the reason I really believe in this is that when you're doing something unfamiliar, like trying something for the first time, there's a kind of vulnerability that you bring to those moments. And I think our vulnerabilities, each of us as people, I think our vulnerabilities are maybe our most precious assets. I really think that. And I think we run roughshod over them all the time. Like culturally, like societally, I think we do that. So I really love to be in that state of trying something that I've never done before. In working in that particular way, I feel like in my work, I'm trying to preference a purpose of making over a kind of craft or expertise in what I'm doing. I think if I try to gather too much expertise, quote unquote, around me, I'll start to think I know what I'm doing. But I think that's the other part of being in the studio, is that we're engaged by all the unknowns that are there. You think you know how you want your drawing to go, but inevitably it's going to be different than you expect it to be. That's a silver lining, I think. And the other thing about doing something you don't know how to do is that it forces you to trust in improvisation and the unknown. And our lives are going towards places we have no idea about. You don't really know how your day is going to end today. I mean, we think we do, and maybe it'll follow a familiar path. But on the off chance that something else happens, it's great to be able to move in an improvisational way in relation to all the elements of your life. So it's like training of a kind. And where we are in our lives is also ever shifting. So it's not like you can, even if you wanted to, repeat the things that you've done before. You can't really do it. So it's simply a nod to the fact that we are constantly in motion. So that's number one. Do something you don't know how to do. I really believe in that. The second point here is say who you are and don't sell who you are. And this is another funny one, because I feel like in our culture, it's a culture that uses a marketing language for almost every aspect of what we do, whether it's in social media or in the classroom, even when you're defending your work. I think it's like we feel like we have to convince people of our authority. So I think the language that we use to promote ourselves, in a way, is like a marketing language. And I think we do this because we feel like it gives us a certain kind of power, and we all want to use power as a disguise in our lives. A disguise for how fragile maybe we feel or how vulnerable we feel. So we're trying to be experts, and we strive to become professionals in different ways because we're scared. I mean, I think that's a basic idea that makes sense to me anyway. And so we're protective of all of our vulnerabilities. So I think to the degree that you can say who you are and not sell who you are is a kind of bringing yourself back to maybe your most important self. And I feel like making work in the studio is one way that I can try to do this. And again, these are not things I'm really good at. This is just what I strive for, these 4 points. So I think it's important to say I don't know and I don't understand when that is the case. I don't think, I think there are benefits from being vulnerable. And then number 3 is a bit of a tangled one, so bear with me while I read it. Number 3 is remember that authority is purchased with obedience, and as a result, obedience and authority exist in equal measure within you at all times. I'll read it one more time. This is a quote from Agnes Martin, by the way, an artist who I really admire in the way she lived her life. Remember, authority is purchased with obedience, and as a result, obedience and authority exist in equal measure within you at all times. This has been a really helpful concept for me philosophically, probably for the last 6 years. And what it means to me is, and let me give you some examples of what she's talking about. If you are a parent to a small child, you have authority over that child's life. You're the caregiver. You're making sure they're okay. But in turn, you have to be obedient in equal measure because you are chasing them around and making sure that they have food, and you are constantly reacting to their needs. So obedience and authority, in my opinion, exist in equal measure in that kind of a position. Similarly, if you're in the President of the United States, there's a certain kind of authority you have as an authority figure, but you are beholden to so many different existing structures and scrutiny on beyond, the normal measure, and to that you have to behave with a certain kind of obedience. Or if, let's say, you're a completely disenfranchised person, let's say you're homeless, you may not have much, perceived authority, but you can have a greater, quantity of disobedience or obedience. So again, the amount that's expected of you is less. So the reason this has been a really important philosophical idea for me is that when I left my teaching job and I was making the decision to live in a pretty remote place and just see if I could make a life with my work, it was a moment where I was shedding a lot of this perceived authority that I had gained in the process of being a teacher and doing other things. And it was challenging, of course, because it's so convenient to just give yourself a title and say that's who you are. But I felt like in the process of leaving some of that behind, I was able to buy myself less obedience in my life. And that slight measure of like a lower level of obedience was to me a kind of freedom. So it was interesting to think in this framework about how to construct a life. I think we've been taught, alongside other things, to believe that power and leadership lead to a kind of freedom, and I think it's a false promise. And in this same bizarre equation, I think we've falsely equated freedom with financial fluency, and I think that's also a false promise. And then, so that was number 3, authority and obedience. And then number 4 is you can always give more than you think you can. And the reason this is on my list for my mantras here is that I always, you reach a personal threshold with a project, maybe you're frustrated with it, maybe you want to give up on it, or obstacles in your life. And I've often felt in those moments, if I could just be a little bit more generous, if I could just be open to doing a little bit more than I felt I was capable of, maybe it'll push me forward into a new place. But also with people in our lives, to be as generous as possible. I'm a parent, I have 2 kids, and it's taxing, and yet there's such a gift to all the push and pull that we engage in. And so for me, it's a way that I encourage myself to stay open and giving, even under duress. So those are my 4 main talking points, and I'll return to them again later. I was going to add as a 5th talking point, but I feel a little bit on the fence about it, but I'm just going to tell it to you, because then maybe that'll be an interesting conversation later. But I was going to say as number 5 that you cannot know the content of your own work. And I think once you see the nature of what I do, it'll make sense in the context of what I'm doing, but it might not make sense for other people. That's true of all of this. This may not make sense for you at all. So you guys are art students. I never once took a sculpture class in my whole life, but everything I do now is sculpture. I started out in printmaking, especially. I was super excited about printmaking. And then once I finished school, it was like that was the moment where I started doing other things. But I'm not going to show you that early work either. With the exception of a handful of slides, I'm showing you all things that were done pretty much in the last year, maybe year and a half, something like that. So this is a site-specific sculpture that I did in the entryway of the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. And it's all made out of trash from the recycling center. It's sheet plastic and tarps, and they've been cut into strips and sewn together as grids, and then hung over this beautiful light well that's in the ceiling of the museum. And talking about doing something you don't know how to do, I had prepared all of these nets, and I really didn't have a very clear sense of how they were going to be installed on site. And it was just installed on site. And the shape of it, which turned out much more graceful than I expected, was simply the shape that a single strand of these nets made, like a natural parabola, as you hung it from one side of the atrium to the other. So it's like the material solved the problem for me. One thing I will say about these really large-scale, kind of challenging projects is that I can never claim full authorship for them, or that's how it feels, because there are so many serendipitous things that happen in the process of working on this scale that at the end there's always like a magical either mishaps or really wonderful accidents that help to bring the piece into being. So for this one, I had no way of anticipating how the light would pool at the bottom of the form and almost seem like it was made of glass or something else, or that the shadows in the whole room, which you can't see as well here, but a little bit on the floor, would have such an unearthly underwater feeling about them. So it's fun thinking maybe we aren't always in charge of what we're doing. This is a cyanotype based off of a photograph of a small sculpture that I made, and I'm showing you this and the next couple slides to talk about how my work really goes between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions all the time and across a lot of different materials. I'm never sure of what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm making sculptures or if I'm making objects to photograph, or if I'm making something from like a still life object from which I can draw, or if I'm just making a birthday present for a good friend. I mean, it's very blurry sometimes how I feel in relation to the things that I'm making. So on the left you see 2 ceramic, they're like handheld size sculptures, like 2 of the first things I ever made in ceramics. They're both slab built. And then on the right you see a collage made from some old woodcut prints that I did. And I love seeing how the 2 relate to each other and how the language is so clear across these different materials. Here's another one. This is a small inflatable I made out of old plastic bags and tape. And I really love these funny, modest kind of slumping forms. They would sort of slump on the shelf over time, and then I had little juice straws and I'd blow them up and then they'd slump. But I used these same little sculptures to make prints. And so what you see on the right is a dry point of basically just taking my, on plexiglass. So I took clear plexiglass and smashed down one of the inflatables and just traced what I saw, and from that came a secondary layer of imagery or another way of imagining this same form or a process. So I feel like each step leads to something else, and it's hard to know you know, where it's going to go. Just another, like reveling in the flatness of a form and the three-dimensionality. And maybe what's beautiful about inflatables is that they're never static. So I learn a lot from these things. This is a photograph of a two-part installation that was at Tsuyama Space in Seattle, Washington. This is a couple years ago. And I just, to further the conversation of 2D to 3D and back again, which happens all the time in my work, I wanted to show you this. On the far wall is a huge woodcut in two layers, and then this sculpture in the middle of the room. And I really saw the woodcut as like the blueprint or the plan from which this three-dimensional sculpture was going to come. And that the blueprint was very idealized and controlled, and then the sculpture itself was kind of messy and bizarre. And there's the woodcut again. And I was thinking loosely of, like, how do you make like a motif out of something really dynamic, like a firework, or you know, something that is inherently ephemeral and momentary. I made the big woodcuts, for those of you printmakers in the room, just by laying out Luan on the floor and carving it there and then printing it with a big team. This was in New Mexico, and we just had to print it with spoons because there's no press large enough for this kind of work. But it was a really fun time getting these prints put together. This is the sculpture once it's totally inflated, so then you can see what I was talking about in terms of the print being a kind of blueprint for this form. But then this form is you know, it's living, breathing. It blows up, it deflates again, it blows up, it deflates. It was on like a 30-minute cycle of doing those things. So it felt like this is real life, and then the print is like the idea about real life or something. And I love going back and forth. And I did one other version of this kind of a form. I was eager to see it just as almost like a drawing with the black lines. Maybe something, again, to draw, not so much as sculpture. But anyway, this was in Sheboygan, that version. Another material I've worked in a lot that seems to, on its own, kind of go between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions is wire. Because you can build with it very easily, almost like a textile. And it flattens perceptually in space. I mean, even from this photograph, it's a little hard to know which end is coming forward and which end is going back. This is called Double Hung, and it was most recently in a show in Richmond, Virginia. And it's all made of steel wire. This one is a crocheted form made from plastic bags. So again, there's just so much material around us. It's not like it makes sense to always work from that supply, but there certainly is so much that we can do with materials that cost us nothing. So this was an attempt to use that material and learn how to crochet, because I'd never done that before, and create some kind of a form that really did have a life of its own. This one's called Crawler. I ended up making a winter hat that's black and white, spiraled like that after making this. And then ceramics. Ceramics is another material that I've really been enjoying, but came to much, you know, just recently. So I've never been schooled in it. I don't know how to use it properly, and maybe that gives me a kind of freedom to use it in ways that people wouldn't. I don't know if that's true, but I really enjoy building with it and thinking about, you know, a lot of familiar forms and ways of thinking about building, like a lattice or some kind of a transparent form, but then doing it in clay instead of in wire. This last summer, I had the huge privilege of being in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I was a visiting artist in the ceramics studio at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And I just had sort of free reign of the studio for a period of about 6 weeks, and I generated, I think, about 30 new pieces in that period of time. It's not always productive in my life, but it was just one of those wonderful happenstance moments. This is called Cowgirl, and it's just, as you see, like hand-worked clay slung over a dowel in the wall. My work, as you can see, looking at it here, it's intuitive. It feels much more like some kind of a quiet interior world than anything external and explicit to me, at least. But one thing I find interesting about it these days is this gesture of slumping over something, which I seem to be repeating. You saw it in the wire sculpture, double hung, and then in Cowgirl, and this one, Dash. There's something about that gesture that's like clearly important to me, and it keeps coming up in my work. This one's called Al Dente. And again, it's just these sort of ridged layers of clay slung over a kind of a support on the wall. And in this case, it's strange because it's very much a two-dimensional form. It's like flat against the wall, but it's also sculptural. So I feel like this conversation between 2D and 3D is ever and ongoing. I was layering black and white clay together to make almost what felt like a delicious confection or like a pastry or something, and then building almost like a painting or a drawing, like collaging these wonderful stripes in different ways, and again, creating kind of wall pieces for them. And this one is called Float. It's a terracotta piece similarly. So you can see in these pieces, they were all created within, days of each other, this feeling of a sameness of language, but like an unknowingness about what I'm doing as well. This one's called Self, and I was just enjoying the way the random black clay blobs would come through. Again, it feels like a textile to me. I don't know why, almost like a weaving. And then I started building these little castles. I was really having a good time. And just making like miniature worlds, miniature structures, and using the black and white clay. So the one in the front is called Citadel, and in the back it's Duomo. These things are tiny. I'm sure that's obvious from the image on the screen, but they absolutely sit in my hand. And again, making them, did I know what they were or to what end or what purpose? I had no idea. They could yet be birthday presents for friends. And then I made a slightly bigger version. When I'm putting together these shows, I really love to think about pedestals, presentation, how work feels in a space. So in other words, the architecture. For these shows, I built since I was in Halifax for this residency, and I knew I had to fit everything into my pickup truck to get home. I created a bunch of slotted pedestals that allowed me to completely flatten both the supports that my sculpture was on and then be able to load my sculptures on top in the back of the truck. So it was designed for a practical purpose, but I really love the simplicity of those slotted forms that you see, the pedestals on the left. This one's called The Castle. And this is Tome. And this was very much a clay piece. It's just a stack of lattice pieces, one on top of the other. But it came from looking at photographs of the castles and feeling like they would translate really beautifully into a woodcut, or they would translate beautifully into some sort of a flatter image. And then I thought, well, low relief would be a beautiful way to look at these too. So one gesture sort of built on the next in the process of making these things. And sorry about the quality of this image, it's not great, but I wanted to show you this was near the very end of my residency, where the lattices were getting more sort of airy and fine with black clay. It's all clay. I find that in working in the studio, it's important to have some kind of a goal in mind, even though you probably will never achieve it. And I think the goal is the way that we can focus our eyes forward so that all this delicious, great stuff can happen in our peripheral vision and in unintended ways as we aim ourselves towards it. I can't tell you the number of times I feel like I've been surprised by something that was essentially discarded on the edge of my work table that later ended up feeling really important to me. And this little one on the right-hand side, called Totem, is one of those. It's nothing, right? But it's also, it has a kind of freedom and freshness about it that a lot of my more purposeful work doesn't have. And so perhaps it is still nothing to most people, but for me, emblematically, it's something unencumbered. And I feel like it's very hard to capture that quality in artwork. And I love the feeling of surprise, of encountering something that's part of my work environment, and I've disregarded it, and then I realize it's exactly something to learn from. So I really believe in peripheral vision and all the incredible surprises that happen there specifically. This is another piece from Halifax. It's called Jigsaw, and I love the idea of coming up with some sort of a slotted game. So each of these little ceramic pieces is black on one side, white on the other, so 2 different layers of clay, and then I notched them with slots so that they could slide together, and I could build a whole variety of different forms with them. So they were not made to build this shape per se, but just to be able to build. So I've had a couple different versions of this since making it. Clay probably isn't the best material to use for something like this because they really do break, at least with this thinness. But I really love the graphic quality of the final built structure and the surprise of what it became as a game. And I have another detail of that. You can see the sort of carved surface of the backside of the clay. I love learning from these materials and feeling like the material is evident in the work and communicating. So more slumping. This is a piece called Trader. It's plywood that's trying to be like rope, which I think is why I called it that. But it is literally strips of luan that are hinged together with a little, like a little section of steel wire, and then I painted each of the joins, and then it just loops. It is continuous looping around and going up and over and looping around with the beginning and the end. And this was in a show I had in Richmond this last spring or early summer. The luan is in my life because of printmaking, not because of sculpture. And I had a residency, here's a detail of it, at the University of Maine in Orono, where I was in the print shop and I was cutting up luan to make woodblock prints. And I made this print with some chunks of luan. Like this, and I was setting them up in the bed of a letterpress, actually, is the tool I was using, and I was just printing them I thought, oh my God, this is going to be so fun. I'm going to have all these little puzzle pieces. I'm going to just be able to construct whatever kind of image I want right in the bed of the press, ink it up, and print it. And I made maybe 2 things that I was happy with while I was there, and just a whole lot of other frustrating moments. But these pieces, what was left over from my efforts at printing, and particularly from this one, are now in, I just decided to turn all those pieces into this sculpture because I had them sitting around. So it was never intended from the beginning that this sculpture would come into being, but because of having all this material to use in printmaking, I turned it around and made it into a sculpture I was a lot happier with. And then just to talk again about how one material or one idea kind of gives rise to another one. This is in my studio looking down at some clay outlines of a form that I found really captivating to look at. And so without having a plan, I was drawing and redrawing this shape in clay and then stacking them. So you can see on the ground behind there were 2 other versions of sort of stacked shapes. And this is just simply a physical process of accreting and seeing time in something that you're working on. And maybe revisiting a simple outline that you don't know why it interests you, but intuitively it does, and repeating it until you create a kind of physical form. So it was very much related, in my mind anyway, to these woodblock prints that I was doing, and this idea of being able to cut a material and print it. But what if you print it again and again? Maybe there's a version of this that could be a print where images are layered on top of each other. So in terms of working across media, I think there is a way that if I make this project in clay, I can think about, as I'm making it, what an equivalent process would be in printmaking. And that's how I can move through ideas, is by switching materials. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a process that is, again, 2D to 3D, but it's also how imagery can be generated just by the most random moments. I was doing some collages out of old National Geographics with my kids, and I was really loving this particular cheetah section and all the patterns that are on these animals, and I started making these little collages. They're really tiny. But then I blew them up. I would scan them and blow them up and translate them into these prints. This is a dry point on Plexi. And I found there was something kind of living and breathing without being explicitly an animal, but the feeling of animalness that was coming out from these collages. Something about how the patterns were emphasizing the form without it being three-dimensional. And it got me very excited about how we think about vanishing points in our work, and at what point are you in a no man's land of reference points, and at what point do you have too many reference points? And it was a great way for me to climb out of one of my cul-de-sacs of abstraction, was to kind of add in this wonderful material like into the compost pile of these prints. So I ended up making these 2-color woodcuts. They're really big, and they're, again, derivations of those same tiny little National Geographic collages, which, by the way, were extremely impulsive in terms of how they were made. I probably made, 15 of them, and probably the one I ended up focusing most on was maybe, less than 5 minutes to put together, and yet it has this reverberating impact on the work. I ended up using these woodblocks in a bunch of different ways. So this is, again, another example of how my work might start in one way, but then evolve to take on other forms. So I made these woodcuts, as you see. I also printed the same blocks onto fabric, and I was curious what it would look like if I tried to recreate in fabric something about the intertwining animal-ish but non-illustrative animal form. So out of soft sculpture, I made the form in the front called Hold, which is sort of weirdly like two bodies intertwined. And then I started loving the block so much, independent of the prints and independent of the sculpture, that I created this piece called Hide, which is the old wood blocks then mended together with steel wire and slung over a bar. So it's like the one project gave rise to so many different iterations, just one thing becoming the next, and this is a detail of the blocks. Once I had decided that I wanted to make this, I didn't have enough wood blocks to create the shape and the form that I then wanted, so I ended up carving a bunch more, only to use for the sculpture that were never printed. This is just an overview of a recent show. You can see Hide through the doorway. You can see one of the prints on the wall. You can see one of my slumped forms, Dash, in the corner. You can see Traitor in the back room. And in the front is a big another wire sculpture that I made called Reveille. I'm going to walk through one more funny, unexpected turn of events in the studio. Another collage turned into prints, one version of which was turned into a woodcut. I was just, I was trying not to do what I don't know how to do. I was trying to do what I knew how to do, which was to once again triumph over the translation of one image to another. And this woodcut never worked out. Anyway, I couldn't stand it. But I really wanted to do something with those blocks. So I ended up trying to recreate the form that was suggested in the image, and I made this sculpture called Attic. And it was literally just cutting with my little jigsaw, making a fold, and pretty soon it was like the whole woodblock was a textile, and I could fold it around and I could start manipulating it as if it was a completely different kind of material. And that was very exciting for me. So it's open on one side. You can see that, all those steel pieces of wire holding it together. But it remained the original wood block. I think it was shaped a little bit, maybe truncated a little bit, but I just brought it into 3 dimensions. There's my studio in the winter, which is fast approaching up there. And I want to finish with this piece, because it just came down. It's the most recent thing I built. It just came down last week, beginning of last week. This little town I live in is super economically depressed. It used to be the heart of like the sardine industry and sardine canning in this part of the coastline, but for years that's been dead. There's huge houses all over town that are just empty. So one of the riches of living in a community like this is that there are these incredible buildings, like really incredible, that are just like a ghost town sitting empty. And there happens to be an organization in town called the Tides Institute and Museum of Art, and they recently acquired this church. It's a 19th century church. It was built in 1819. And it's gorgeous, but it's a church without a congregation. It's an old building. You know, the shipbuilders who also used to live in this town would build the churches too. And so they had these beautiful arch ceilings and just incredible overlap between these communities, the sort of church community, the fishing community. And so fishing is now no longer really happening up there. It is. It's still one of the local industries, but not on the scale that it was. And then these churches are also empty. So there's like this feeling of ghosts being everywhere, the ghosts of all these past times and people and places. So I had the opportunity to think about some kind of an installation to put in this church. And whenever I work on a really huge scale, I can never imagine affording any kind of fancy material on a large scale. So this is all made from cardboard from the local recycling center. I probably could have made like 7 of these from the amount of recycling, cardboard that was sitting there. And it's a piece that measures maybe about 40 feet. It comes about 40 feet out from the wall. And it spans, I think it's about 28 feet wide. And it's like almost like a boat hull. I was thinking of it as almost like the skeleton of a whale or a boat hull, but also something that mirrors the arch of the ceiling and is kind of an embrace of that building. It's called Undertow. And this is a view of it from the choir loft. There's a wonderful choir loft at the back of the building that allows you to look out into the space. I don't think Eastport has probably seen large-scale sculpture like this before. It was such a private experience coming to see the show because there's such a small population there. It was never more than 1 or 2 people pretty much in the church at a time. And the light changed amazingly on the Forum during the day. Near the end of the run of this installation, it was up for a couple months, I was really eager to have some sort of an event or a happening that was not centered around the sculpture, but the sculpture would be present for it. So we decided to read all of Moby Dick, which is a famous book by an author named Herman Melville, who was similarly from New England coastal community. He had been on a whaling ship, and it's a really great book if you ever get a chance to read it. And so it took us 24 hours to read this book from beginning to end, and we stayed up all night in the church with a little lamp and an armchair on the front stage area. And there were mostly no more than 3 people in the room for this. It's kind of like one of these absurd things you do in your life, and it kind of feels absurd the whole time you're doing it, and yet at the end you're like, that was something I've never experienced before, and it was so great to read this book in the presence of all of these ghosts and the feeling of this installation. So that was great. I can't remember if that's my last slide. So Undertow. So to conclude, I'm just going to read you guys my mantra again, and then I'm going to be really super eager for questions. So as I'm reading the mantra, you can gather your questions, okay? So number 1 again was do something you don't know how to do. Number 2, say who you are, don't sell who you are. Number 3, remember authority is purchased with obedience, and as a result, Obedience and authority exist in equal measure within you at all times. Number 4, you can always give more than you think you can. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Have you ever read the book Daring Greatly?
No. No.
It's like how vulnerability, like the act of vulnerability helps you live life in like a great way.
Can you tell me that again, the title?
Daring Greatly?
Greatly? Really? That's someone's last name?
No, it's Daring Greatly by
Oh, Daring Greatly. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Renee Brown. That's more believable. Okay.
I thought you might like that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
For the large installations that you do you usually see the space first, or do you usually like
Did everybody hear that question? Her question was, for the large installations I do I always see the space first, or do I just go and wing it? You know, there's always a little bit of a combination. Usually there's blueprints and plans that are shared with me ahead of time, and then I go into a heavy-duty model making phase where I try to reconstruct based on those architectural plans what the building is like. This is if I'm not close to it, personally. And then I build. But even with all of that preparation, it's always a surprise how the building actually is. So once you get there, there's inevitably changes you have to make. But that's a great question. Usually I have some sense. Yeah. Yes?
So I know you said that you cannot know the content of your own work.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your content is coming from the forms that you make first, or that you are sort of having something in mind that is the content, that is like a concept running through, and then the forms come from that? Because they're all, they're all pretty similar and actually remind me a lot of my own work. But
yeah, I'm not sure. I know. Certainly, there's the feeling like, oh, this gesture feels good right now. So then there's a way in which I find myself repeating it in different materials. The degree to which I go into it with that explicit intention is more or less, depending on how risk-oriented I am in the moment, probably. But then there's a lot that the material, I feel like, does to help guide what I'm up to, because my work is so much based in the qualities and behaviors of materials. So there are certain gestures that come into being not because I want it to be that way, but because that's what the material wants to do. So in terms of the content, which has always been a hard thing for me because I feel like it exists so much outside the world of language, I'm not sure. Yes, background.
How do you choose what kind of holes you're going to slump things over?
Say that again, sorry.
You like to slump things over a lot of holes, but how do you choose what kind of hole you're going to slump?
Oh yeah, good question. You mean whether it's going to be steel or wood or what? Yeah, I think it's just what you guys are going to hate these answers of mine. I think it's just what feels right. Like, ceramic on metal is like a very grating, it makes a very grating, jarring sound. So I tend to put ceramic things over wood because it's a softer material. And also, I don't weld, although I really want to learn how. So certain things is just not as easily accessible material-wise. So, but I think there is usually like like certain materials like each other more or less. I mean, if I was really interested in very grating, jarring kinds of expressions, maybe I'd be putting all my ceramics on metal. But yeah. Yes?
How did you start getting recognized as an artist?
I don't know if I am recognized as an artist. Yes?
I feel like there's a lot of repeated patterns in your work, and a lot of what you seem to be doing is definitely having an intuitive response to into like some sort of sensory stimulus that you're experiencing, but it seems like there's sort of this process of organizing that seems to be taking place, or categorizing, where you're breaking things down at these really kind of fundamental levels, and then like rearranging and trying to like find this final endpoint where they reconcile themselves in this new way. And I wanted to know, are you like a very organized, categorical person? Do you consider yourself an organized, categorical person, like consciously in your life, or like what is the relationship there?
That is a really, I love all your observations. I wanted to be like, what else do you see? Because, you know, I don't know, we learn so much from what other people bring to the work, but I think you're right on target. I think it's because I have so much mental chaos that I like my environments to be very still and organized, not necessarily like anally clean or anything, but just like visually organized. It helps me to think. So, and I think that when I'm in the middle of a project and it feels like I'm in that suspended place before there's any kind of sense of where it's going to go or conclusion, I feel so uncomfortable, you know? So there is a way in which I do rush to these kind of still, kind of finished forms, because it's when I can rest again. So perhaps it's that tendency that you're picking up on too, that sense of a system or some kind of order or a real sense of finish. Or they're enclosed forms too. They're kind of isolated and enclosed forms, a lot of them. So I'm sure that says something about me. Yeah?
Were all of these works shown made in the past 5 or 6 years since you moved to the small town?
All the ceramics, except for those 2 at the very beginning, yes. And the prints are, no, those were all from that time too, yeah.
Do you think it affected all the sense of living in that environment?
Definitely, and it may, I mean, it's not like, oh, I'm living on the edge of the Bay of Fundy, I'm going to do, you know, images that talk about the rising tides, not in that explicit way. And I'm not suggesting that you're thinking that either, but there is some way in which the nature of my life in this town, I'm sure is affecting my work in all kinds of ways. Also, you know, I used to teach, and so this practice of putting my work into language and helping other people to put work into language, it's not something I'm doing anymore. I mean, I'm in my studio alone, you know, in the quiet, and so there's a way in which I feel like all these mute forms, these forms without, in my mind, forms without language, I'm not questioning as much what the point is. I think I've gotten better where I'm living now, and it could just be where I'm at in my life too. But I think I'm getting better at just simply following those impulses without trying to question too much, because we all do that. I mean, question everything all the time. So that's hard, but I think those voices, I can push them away a little bit more easily there. Yeah.
I think we're going to have to
And
wrap it up just
okay.
to time. But thank you very much for a marvelous lecture.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you all.